The wooden crate looked absurd, roughly the size of a shoebox, painted olive drab with a hinged lid that creaked like a rusty gate. British sappers gathered around it in the North African sand, their laughter echoing across the makeshift testing ground outside Tobruk. One engineer kicked it gently with his boot, another called it a bloody letterbox. A third suggested it might be useful for storing tea rations. The man who built it, a 32-year-old lieutenant with oil-stained hands and dark circles under his eyes, said nothing. He simply connected the detonator, walked 50 yards away, and pressed the plunger. The explosion tore through the morning air with such violence that men a quarter-mile distant felt the concussion in their chests. When the smoke cleared, a crater 6 feet deep marked where the crate had been. The sappers stopped laughing. 6 months later, that same design would destroy 6 German supply trucks in 9 seconds flat, turning a critical resupply convoy into burning wreckage and altering the tactical calculations of an entire theatre of war. His name was Cecil Vandepeer Clarke, and the weapon that would bear his mark represented something the British Army desperately needed but rarely admitted: a way to fight dirty, think smaller, and win ugly against an enemy that had perfected the art of mobile warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not in the desert, but in the crambled offices of British military intelligence in Cairo, August 1942. The war in North Africa had reached a brutal stalemate. The Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed British forces back to El Alamein, just 60 miles from Alexandria. The Germans held a supply line stretching from Tripoli to the front, a 1,400-mile umbilical cord of trucks, fuel depots, and ammunition dumps that kept their panzers rolling and their artillery firing. British commanders understood a fundamental truth: cut those supply lines, and Rommel's mechanized divisions would starve. But how do you cut a supply line that stretches across 1,000 miles of desert, guarded by mobile patrols, defended by air cover, and moving constantly to avoid aerial reconnaissance? Traditional sabotage required large teams of commandos, extensive planning, and considerable luck. By the time intelligence identified a target, the convoy had moved. By the time raiders reached the location, the trucks were gone. What the British needed was not a bigger hammer, but a smaller, smarter, and infinitely more portable weapon. Something a single man could carry. Something that could be hidden anywhere. Something that looked harmless until the moment it killed. Enter Captain Cecil Vandepeer Clarke, though even his superiors struggled to define exactly what he was. Not quite an engineer, though he understood explosives better than most sappers. Not quite a commando, though he had completed the grueling training at Aknakari. Not quite an inventor, though his workshop in Cairo produced devices that no military manual had ever contemplated. Clarke was that rare breed of military irregular, a man who saw war not as a series of battles to be fought honorably, but as a collection of problems to be solved creatively. Before the war, he had worked in demolitions for a mining company in Rhodesia, a job that taught him the precise mathematics of explosive force, the chemistry of stable versus unstable compounds, and the art of making large things fall down with minimal resources. When war came, he enlisted immediately, was commissioned based on his technical expertise, and promptly horrified his commanding officers by suggesting that proper British soldiers should learn to fight like criminals, saboteurs, and terrorists. His first innovation had been rejected as too crude. A spring-loaded mine disguised as camel dung, designed to be scattered along roads used by German convoys. The explosive content was small, intended not to destroy vehicles, but to puncture tires, crack oil pans, and force convoys to stop for repairs in exposed positions where RAF aircraft could find them. The top brass called it ungentlemanly. Clarke pointed out that gentlemen were losing the war. His second attempt fared better. A magnetic mine that could be attached to the hull of ships in harbor, set with a time delay fuse that allowed the saboteur to escape before detonation. The device was elegant in its simplicity. A steel casing containing 3 pounds of plastic explosive, 4 powerful magnets, and a chemical time delay pencil fuse that could be set for anywhere from 10 minutes to 24 hours. The mine worked beautifully in tests, sinking a captured Italian merchant vessel in Alexandria harbor with a blast that impressed even skeptical Royal Navy observers. But the magnetic mine had limitations. It required waterborne targets, calm enough conditions for a swimmer to approach undetected, and enemy ships obliging enough to remain in harbor until the fuse expired. What Clarke needed was something more versatile, something that could destroy trucks on desert roads, fuel dumps in forward positions, ammunition depots behind enemy lines, something that combined the portability of a hand grenade with the destructive power of an artillery shell, something that a single commando could carry into enemy territory, place with minimal training, and detonate with absolute certainty. The problem consumed him through the scorching summer of 1942. He filled notebooks with sketches, covered blackboards with calculations, and conducted experiments that occasionally resulted in unplanned explosions that rattled windows across Cairo. His workshop, located in a commandeered warehouse near the rail yards, became a combination laboratory, machine shop, and demolitions testing ground. Local civilians learned to recognize the sound of Clarke's experiments and prudently moved to other neighborhoods when they heard the lieutenant was working on something new. The technical challenges were formidable. The explosive charge needed to be large enough to destroy a truck or ammunition crate, but small enough for a single man to carry multiple devices. The casing needed to be strong enough to protect the explosive during rough handling, but not so heavy that it added unnecessary weight. The detonator needed to be reliable enough to function in extreme heat, resistant enough to withstand the shock of being dropped or thrown, and simple enough that commandos with minimal training could arm it in darkness under enemy fire. Most critically, the device needed to be concealable. A mine that looked like a mine would be detected and disarmed. What Clarke needed was a shape so innocent, so ordinary, so completely beneath notice that enemy soldiers would walk past it without a second glance. The breakthrough came in September 1942 during a supply inspection at a British forward depot. Clarke watched as quartermasters unloaded crates from trucks, stacking them in neat rows under camouflage netting. The crates varied in size and shape, long wooden boxes containing rifles, squat metal containers holding ammunition, rectangular wooden cases packed with rations. One particular crate caught his attention. Roughly 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, 6 inches deep, with a hinged lid secured by a simple metal clasp. The kind of anonymous wooden box that militaries had used for a century to transport small items, medical supplies, or specialized equipment. Completely unremarkable, utterly forgettable. Precisely what Clarke needed. He requisitioned a dozen empty crates and returned to his workshop. The design that emerged over the following weeks represented a masterpiece of lethal simplicity. The wooden crate would serve as the outer shell, maintaining its innocent appearance. Inside, Clarke would install a metal liner containing approximately 2 pounds of plastic explosive, a British development called Composition C that combined the stability of research department explosive with the moldability of modeling clay. The explosive would be shaped to maximize the force of the blast in a directional pattern, focusing the energy outward and downward to ensure maximum damage to anything nearby. The detonator would be a chemical time delay pencil, a glass vial containing acid that would slowly eat through a wire, restraining a spring-loaded firing pin. When the wire corroded through, the pin would strike a percussion cap, which would ignite the explosive. The beauty of the chemical fuse was its reliability. Unlike clockwork mechanisms that could jam or electrical systems that could fail, the chemical reaction proceeded at a predictable rate determined by the concentration of the acid. A thick vial meant a longer delay. A thin vial meant a faster reaction. Commandos could select the appropriate fuse based on mission requirements. Need to be 50 miles away when the explosion occurred. Use a 12-hour fuse. Need to hit multiple targets in rapid succession. Use a 30-minute fuse. The timing was adjustable, the system was simple, and once activated, there was no way to stop it. The final touch was Clarke's innovation. The crate would be designed to look not just innocent, but inviting. The hinged lid would open easily, revealing an interior packed with what appeared to be standard military supplies. Bandages, perhaps, or spare parts, or tinned rations. Items that would tempt an enemy soldier to investigate, to open the crate, perhaps even to appropriate the contents for personal use. Clarke called it social engineering before the term existed. He was designing not just a bomb, but a psychological trap that exploited human curiosity, greed, and the universal soldier's instinct to scavenge anything useful from the enemy. The first prototype was completed in late September 1942. Clarke armed it with a live charge and a 30-minute fuse, placed it in the center of a testing ground surrounded by sandbags, and invited a handful of observers from the Royal Engineers and the Special Operations Executive. The assembled officers examined the device with the skepticism that professional soldiers reserve for inventors who promise miracle weapons. One major picked up the crate, shook it gently, and commented that it seemed rather heavy for its size. A colonel opened the lid, peered inside at the innocent-looking contents, and asked whether Clarke really believed German soldiers would be foolish enough to investigate a suspicious box. Clarke said nothing. He activated the fuse, placed the crate on the ground, and invited everyone to move behind the protective barrier. 31 minutes later, the explosion transformed the testing ground into a smoking crater. The blast was asymmetric, focusing its energy in a cone-shaped pattern that would have shredded anything within a 20-foot radius. Shrapnel from the wooden casing added secondary fragmentation that extended the lethal radius to nearly 40 feet. The sandbags placed at various distances showed the effect clearly. Those within 10 feet were torn to pieces. Those at 20 feet were holed and scattered. Those at 30 feet showed pockmarks, but remained intact. A test truck, positioned 25 feet from the blast point, had its fuel tank punctured, its tires shredded, and its cargo bed filled with wooden splinters. In a real combat situation, that truck would have been a burning wreck within seconds. The observers were impressed. More importantly, they were convinced. By October 1942, Clarke had authorization to produce 100 prototype devices, training manuals for their deployment, and orders to conduct field trials with commando units operating behind German lines. The weapon received an official designation, the Demolition Charge Number 7, Mark I. Commandos called it something simpler and infinitely more descriptive, Clarke's box, or sometimes, with the dark humor of men who worked with explosives, the letter bomb. Despite having nothing to do with mail systems, the name stuck because it captured the essence of the weapon's deception. It looked like something meant to contain items, not destroy them. Production began immediately at a workshop in Cairo, where Egyptian craftsmen worked under Clarke's supervision to manufacture the devices in quantity. The wooden crates were built to standard military specifications, deliberately made to match the thousands of identical boxes used throughout the British supply system. The metal liners were fabricated from sheet steel, carefully shaped to direct the blast pattern. The explosive was measured, cut, and molded to fit precisely within the casing, with no wasted space and no excess weight. Each device was assembled by hand, tested for structural integrity, and packed carefully for transport to forward units. By November 1942, the first shipment of 50 Clarke's boxes reached commando units preparing for raids behind German lines. The training process was surprisingly simple. Commandos learned to identify suitable placement locations, near fuel drums, beside ammunition crates, underneath parked vehicles, anywhere the explosion would cause maximum secondary damage. They learned to arm the fuses correctly, breaking the glass vial that released the acid without accidentally triggering the device prematurely. They learned to camouflage the boxes with local materials, making them appear to be just another piece of military debris in a landscape littered with abandoned equipment. Most importantly, they learned to think like their enemy. Where would a German soldier be most likely to investigate a suspicious crate? Near established encampments where scavenging was common, in supply depots where inventory was constantly shifting, along retreat routes where abandoned equipment might contain useful items. The psychology was simple. Soldiers in war zones are opportunistic. A crate that appears to have been left behind represents a potential windfall of useful supplies. Human nature dictates investigation. Clarke's box transformed that natural curiosity into a lethal vulnerability. The first operational use occurred in mid-November 1942 during a long-range desert group patrol deep behind German lines. A four-man team, operating from heavily modified Chevrolet trucks, had spent 3 weeks conducting reconnaissance along the coastal road between Benghazi and Tripoli, and their mission was intelligence gathering, not combat. They were to observe, report, and avoid engagement. But on November 18, 1942, they received a coded radio message from Cairo. A German supply convoy would be passing through a specific sector within the next 48 hours. The convoy was critical, carrying fuel and ammunition intended for Rommel's armored divisions, preparing for a renewed offensive. Intelligence had identified the convoy's route, schedule, and composition: 12 trucks, 2 armored cars, approximately 40 soldiers. Far too strong a force for 4 commandos to engage directly, but Cairo had included an additional instruction. The patrol was carrying 2 Clarke's boxes. They were authorized to use them. The patrol commander, a captain whose name remains classified in official records, even 80 years later, made a decision that would validate Clarke's entire concept. Rather than attempt a direct ambush, which would have been suicidal against superior numbers, he would use the explosives to create a delayed trap. The team identified a location where the coastal road passed through a narrow defile between rocky outcrops. German convoys traveling this route typically stopped briefly to allow scouts to clear the high ground, a sensible precaution against ambush. During these stops, drivers often dismounted to check vehicles, stretch their legs, and relieve themselves. It was a predictable pattern, observed over weeks of reconnaissance. Human nature in military form. The commandos moved into position the night before the convoy's expected arrival. They placed the first Clarke's box beside a cluster of fuel drums that appeared to have been abandoned by retreating British forces. The second device was positioned near what looked like a damaged supply truck, deliberately staged to appear as though it had broken down and been left behind. Both boxes were armed with 6-hour fuses and carefully camouflaged with sand and debris. Then the commandos withdrew to an observation position 2 miles distant, settled in with binoculars and a radio, and waited. The German convoy arrived at 0900 hours on November the 19th, 1942, precisely on schedule. 12 trucks in single file, each laden with supplies, accompanied by 2 armored cars providing security. The convoy commander, following established procedure, halted the column while scouts dismounted to check the high ground for hidden enemies. What happened next was observed through binoculars from 2 miles away and recorded in an after-action report that now resides in the National Archives in London. German soldiers dismounting from trucks during the security halt immediately noticed the abandoned fuel drums and the damaged supply truck. Several soldiers approached to investigate, drawn by the prospect of salvageable materials. One soldier attempted to move one of the fuel drums, testing its weight to determine if it contained usable fuel. Another soldier approached the supply truck, peering into the cargo bed. A third soldier noticed the wooden crate positioned near the fuel drums. He called to his companions. 2 more soldiers approached. One bent down to examine the crate more closely. He lifted the lid. At that precise moment, both chemical fuses, armed 6 hours and 47 minutes earlier, completed their acid-etching cycle. The spring-loaded firing pins struck their percussion caps simultaneously, 2 pounds of composition C explosive detonated in each location within a fraction of a second. The first blast, positioned among the fuel drums, created a spectacular secondary explosion as aviation fuel ignited in a massive fireball. The second blast, underneath the false supply truck, showered the immediate area with shrapnel and ignited the truck's remaining fuel tank. 6 German trucks parked in close formation during the security halt were caught in the overlapping blast radius. Fuel tanks ruptured, ammunition crates detonated, wooden cargo beds caught fire. Within 9 seconds, the entire convoy had transformed from an organized military formation into a scene of utter chaos. Soldiers dove for cover. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The armored cars, designed to fight enemies they could see, found themselves helpless against explosions that had already occurred. The commandos, watching from their distant observation post, confirmed the destruction through binoculars, transmitted a brief radio report to Cairo, and quietly withdrew deeper into the desert before German reinforcements could arrive. The entire engagement, from the moment the convoy halted to the moment of detonation, lasted less than 12 minutes. The commandos never fired a shot. They never exposed themselves to enemy fire. They simply placed 2 wooden boxes, armed 2 fuses, and let German curiosity do the rest. The success of that first strike sent shockwaves through British military intelligence that extended far beyond the tactical destruction of 6 supply trucks. Within 72 hours, the after-action report reached the desk of Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, newly appointed commander of the 8th Army. Montgomery, a meticulous planner who valued innovation when it produced measurable results, immediately recognized the strategic implications. Here was a weapon that multiplied force, that turned individual commandos into strategic assets capable of disrupting enemy logistics without requiring air support, artillery preparation, or large infantry formations. Within a week, production orders for Clarke's box increased from 100 units to 500. Within a month, every commando unit, long-range desert group patrol, and special air service squadron operating in North Africa had received shipments of the devices, along with detailed training materials. Clarke himself was promoted to major and given expanded resources to develop additional variants. The wooden box design, proven effective, became the template for an entire family of improvised explosive devices, each tailored to specific tactical situations. The impact on German logistics was immediate and profound. Throughout December 1942 and January 1943, reports filtered back from reconnaissance, patrols, and intercepted German communications describing a pattern of mysterious explosions devastating supply convoys along the coastal road. German commanders, initially suspecting aerial bombardment or long-range artillery, eventually realized they faced something more insidious: sabotage devices that could be planted anywhere by anyone and detonated hours or days later without warning. The psychological effect proved as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers became paranoid about abandoned equipment. Supply dumps required elaborate security procedures. Every wooden crate, every fuel drum, every piece of military debris became a potential threat. Convoys began traveling at night, using circuitous routes, stopping only in locations that could be thoroughly searched. These precautions slowed movement, consumed manpower, and diverted resources from frontline operations. Rommel himself, in a communication to Berlin, intercepted by ultra-code breakers, complained that British sabotage operations had reduced his effective supply capacity by an estimated 15%, not through direct destruction, but through the delays and security measures required to counter the threat. 15% might seem modest, but in desert warfare, where every gallon of fuel and every shell mattered, it represented the difference between offensive capability and defensive stalemate. Clarke, meanwhile, continued refining his invention. The Mark II version, introduced in January 1943, featured an improved chemical fuse with more reliable timing and a modified explosive charge that produced enhanced fragmentation. The Mark III, completed in March, included an anti-handling device that would detonate the charge if anyone attempted to move the box after it had been placed. This variant was particularly effective in supply depots, where German soldiers attempting to clear suspicious items would trigger secondary explosions. But Clarke understood that technological innovation alone was insufficient. The true power of his device lay not in its explosive force, but in the tactical doctrine surrounding its employment. He spent weeks working with commando instructors at the Special Training School in Haifa, developing comprehensive training programs that taught not just mechanical operation, but strategic thinking. Commandos learned to identify high-value targets, to assess risk versus reward, to plan escape routes, and most critically, to think probabilistically about enemy behavior. Where would Germans be most likely to investigate? What items would seem most valuable? How could innocent-looking placement maximize the chance of enemy interaction? These were not engineering questions, but psychological ones, and Clarke approached them with the same analytical rigor he applied to explosive chemistry. The most significant deployment occurred during Operation Pugilist, the final Allied offensive that would drive Axis forces from North Africa in spring 1943. As Montgomery's Eighth Army advanced from the east and American forces pushed from the west, German and Italian units found themselves compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket in Tunisia. Their supply situation, already precarious, became desperate. Convoys running the gauntlet between Sicily and Tunisian ports faced devastating losses from Allied air and naval forces. Those supplies that did reach North African soil had to travel overland through territory increasingly penetrated by Allied special forces. In March 1943, the Special Air Service launched Operation Begonia, a coordinated campaign to interdict Axis supply lines using Clarke's boxes as the primary weapon. 20 teams, each consisting of 4 to 6 men, were inserted by parachute and overland infiltration into positions astride major supply routes. Each team carried between 6 and 12 explosive devices. Their orders were simple: create maximum disruption with minimum risk. Over a 3-week period, these teams planted explosives at fuel depots, ammunition dumps, repair facilities, and along convoy routes. The tactical approach varied based on local conditions. Some teams placed devices in locations where they would be discovered quickly, relying on immediate curiosity to trigger detonation. Others positioned charges with extended fuses, allowing time to target multiple locations before any explosions occurred. A few particularly bold teams entered Axis-controlled towns at night, placing devices in supply dumps within earshot of enemy billets. The results exceeded all projections. 73 confirmed explosions over 21 days. Estimated destruction included 42 supply trucks, 17 fuel bowsers, 8 ammunition storage facilities, and countless smaller targets. Secondary explosions and fires caused additional damage, impossible to quantify precisely. But the statistics, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real impact lay in the cumulative psychological toll on Axis forces, already strained to breaking point. German soldiers, exhausted from months of retreat, inadequately supplied, facing overwhelming Allied superiority in men and material, now had to contend with an invisible enemy that struck from within. Every supply delivery became suspect. Every abandoned item represented potential death. The paranoia was corrosive, eating away at unit cohesion and morale more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. Italian units, whose commitment to the Axis cause had been wavering since the disasters of El Alamein and Stalingrad, began surrendering in increasing numbers. Many Italian soldiers interviewed after capture cited the constant threat of sabotage as a factor in their decision to quit fighting. They spoke of watching supplies they desperately needed explode without warning, of seeing comrades killed by devices hidden in innocent-looking crates, of the grinding psychological toll of knowing that anything could be a bomb. By May 1943, when Axis forces in North Africa finally surrendered, Clarke's box had become part of the standard arsenal of Allied special operations. Production continued at workshops in Cairo, Haifa, and newly established facilities in Algiers. Training programs expanded to include American OSS operatives, Free French commandos, and partisan groups preparing for operations in occupied Europe. The device that had begun as one man's solution to a tactical problem had evolved into a strategic weapon that would see use across every theater of the war. In Italy, resistance fighters used Clarke's boxes to attack German supply lines, supporting the defense of Monte Cassino and the Gothic Line. In France, special operations executive teams supplied similar devices to French resistance cells, who employed them with devastating effect against railroad yards, fuel depots, and German garrison supplies in the months leading up to D-Day. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans received shipments that they used to harass German occupation forces throughout 1944. In Burma, Chindit columns, operating behind Japanese lines, adapted the design for use against Japanese supply dumps along the Burma Road. The fundamental principle remained constant. Small teams, using portable explosives, could achieve strategic effects far beyond their numerical strength, provided they understood both the technology and the psychology of their enemy. Clarke himself never achieved the fame of more celebrated military inventors. His name appears in few histories of the war. No monuments commemorate his innovations. He received a modest decoration, the Military Cross, for his contributions, but the citation was vague and the ceremony private. Security concerns dictated that the full extent of his work remained classified long after the war ended. He returned to civilian life in 1946, resumed his career in mining demolitions, and spoke rarely of his wartime service. When historians eventually tracked him down in the 1970s for oral history projects, he proved to be a reluctant subject, uncomfortable with attention and dismissive of suggestions that his work had been particularly significant. "I built bombs," he told one interviewer. "Clever bombs, perhaps, but still just bombs. The men who used them were the real heroes. They carried those devices into enemy territory, placed them under fire, and escaped to fight another day. I worked in a safe workshop in Cairo. They risked their lives every time they went out, say." Yet, Clarke's humility could not diminish the significance of what he had achieved. His invention represented a fundamental shift in how modern militaries thought about asymmetric warfare. Before Clarke's box, sabotage required either large quantities of explosives delivered by vulnerable bombers or risky commando raids that often resulted in heavy casualties. Clarke demonstrated that a single man with a cleverly designed device could achieve what previously required squadrons or companies. The implications extended far beyond World War II. The doctrine of using improvised explosive devices to disrupt conventional military operations became a cornerstone of irregular warfare throughout the 20th century. Resistance movements, insurgent groups, and special operations forces worldwide studied and adapted Clarke's fundamental principles, used deception to achieve placement, exploit enemy psychology to ensure interaction, maximize secondary effects to multiply damage. The device itself evolved through countless iterations. Time delay fuses gave way to command detonation systems, then to radio-controlled triggers, then to sophisticated electronic systems. Wooden boxes were replaced by plastic containers, metal canisters, and eventually entirely improvised materials. But the core concept remained Clarke's. Make the weapon look innocent, place it where the enemy will find it, and let curiosity do the rest. Modern military doctrine regarding improvised explosive devices acknowledges this lineage. Training manuals used by Special Operations Forces contain sections on psychological placement theory that trace their intellectual ancestry directly to Clarke's wartime innovations. The terminology has changed. The technology has advanced exponentially, but the fundamental understanding that the most effective sabotage device is one the enemy doesn't recognize remains unchanged. For the soldiers who actually employed Clarke's boxes in combat, the experience left profound impressions that shaped their understanding of warfare's nature. Captain David Sterling, founder of the Special Air Service, wrote in his post-war memoirs that learning to use improvised explosives fundamentally changed how he thought about tactical problems. "We had been trained to think in terms of direct action," Sterling noted. "Engage the enemy, destroy him through superior skill or firepower, withdraw." Clarke taught us to think indirectly. Don't fight the enemy on his terms. Create situations where his own actions lead to his destruction. It was a profoundly different philosophy, and it made us far more effective. Other veterans expressed darker reflections on the moral implications of using deception-based weapons. Unlike combat, where enemies faced each other openly, Clarke's boxes killed through subterfuge. German soldiers who investigated suspicious crates were not engaged in combat at the moment of death. They were curious or greedy or simply following orders to inventory captured supplies. Some commandos who employed the devices struggled with this ambiguity. Lieutenant Colonel William Fraser, who commanded numerous SAS operations employing Clarke's boxes, addressed this tension in a letter written to Clarke in 1947. "We killed men who never saw us, never knew we existed, never had a chance to fight back. War has always had these elements. I suppose snipers kill from concealment, artillery strikes from miles away, but there was something particularly cold-blooded about your invention. We would place the device, withdraw to safety, and hours later, men would die, not because they were attacking us, but because they opened a box." Fraser continued, "I mention this not to criticize, but to acknowledge what we did. It was necessary. It was effective. It saved Allied lives and shortened the war. But it was not glorious, and it was not honorable in any traditional sense. It was simply warfare, reduced to its essential purpose, making the enemy unable to continue fighting." Clarke's response to Fraser's letter, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, provides insight into how the inventor himself grappled with the moral weight of his creation. "You are right that there is nothing honorable about bombs hidden in wooden boxes," Clarke wrote, "but I would argue there is nothing particularly honorable about any method of killing. The bullet is more honest than the bomb, only in the sense that the victim sees it coming. The final result is the same. War itself is the moral catastrophe. The methods we use within that catastrophe are simply tools, each with its own cost and consequence." He concluded with a reflection that captured the essential tragedy of all military innovation. "I created a weapon that killed efficiently and impersonally. In doing so, I helped end a war against an enemy who had to be defeated. I do not apologize for that, but neither do I celebrate it. The measure of a weapon's worth is not its cleverness, but its necessity. Clarke's box was necessary. That it was also clever is merely technical detail. The human cost of Clarke's invention is impossible to calculate with precision. Official records document 73 confirmed explosions during Operation Begonia alone, but the total number of Clarke's boxes employed throughout the war remains unknown. Production records suggest several thousand devices were manufactured between 1942 and 1945. Not all were used. Some were destroyed when Allied positions were overrun. Others were employed in operations whose records remain classified. Many simply disappeared into the chaos of military logistics, lost or abandoned or forgotten. What can be stated with certainty is that the device killed. German soldiers investigating suspicious crates died instantly or were maimed horrifically. Italian troops loading what appeared to be standard supply boxes were caught in explosions that gave no warning and offered no chance for survival. In Yugoslavia, Japanese-occupied Burma and occupied France, enemy soldiers and sometimes civilians caught in secondary explosions paid the price for a weapon designed to exploit human curiosity. The moral calculus of these deaths is complex. Every German soldier killed by Clarke's box was one fewer shooting at Allied troops. Every supply truck destroyed was fuel and ammunition unavailable for use against Allied advances. The strategic benefit was measurable and significant, but the individual human tragedies represented by each explosion remained tragedies nonetheless. Young men, far from home, dying because they opened a wooden box. The final accounting of Clarke's box must acknowledge both its effectiveness and its cost. As a weapon, it succeeded brilliantly, achieving tactical objectives far beyond its modest size and simple construction. As an innovation, it demonstrated that asymmetric warfare could be systematized, taught, and employed at scale. As a psychological weapon, it proved that fear and uncertainty could be as effective as physical destruction in degrading enemy capability. But as a symbol of modern warfare's evolution, it represented something more troubling: the progressive removal of combat from direct human interaction. The soldier who plants an explosive device and withdraws before detonation never sees his victim. The psychological distance makes killing easier, more abstract, less immediately traumatic. This distancing would continue throughout the 20th century, culminating in drone warfare where operators thousands of miles from combat zones press buttons that unleash missiles on distant targets. Clarke's box was an early step in that progression, a weapon that killed without requiring the user to witness death. Whether this evolution represents progress or moral regression remains a question each generation must answer for itself. In the years following World War II, Clarke lived quietly, avoiding publicity and rarely discussing his wartime work. He died in 1984 at the age of 74, his obituary making only passing reference to his military service. No major newspaper marked his passing with feature articles. No military ceremonies honored his contributions. He was buried in a small cemetery in Rhodesia, his gravestone bearing only his name and dates, with no mention of the weapon that bore his name. Yet his legacy persists in the doctrines and training programs of special operations forces worldwide. The fundamental principles he established, that small teams with clever devices can achieve strategic effects, that deception is as important as explosive force, that understanding enemy psychology is as critical as understanding chemistry, remain cornerstones of irregular warfare. Clarke's box itself has long since been superseded by more sophisticated weapons, but the thinking behind it continues to shape how modern militaries approach asymmetric conflict. The story of Clarke's box is ultimately a story about innovation born from necessity, about how war forces technological evolution, and about the complex moral landscape that soldiers and inventors must navigate when developing new methods of killing. Cecil Vandepeer Clarke created something the British Army needed desperately, a way for small teams to achieve large effects, to fight smarter rather than harder, to win through cleverness when conventional superiority was unavailable. That his invention succeeded is historical fact. That it saved Allied lives by shortening the war is reasonable conclusion. That it represents the best of human ingenuity applied to the worst of human activities is the fundamental irony of all military innovation. The wooden box that British sappers mocked in the North African desert proved to be more than it appeared, just as Clarke intended. It was a weapon, a psychological tool, a force multiplier, and ultimately a small but significant factor in the Allied victory that ended the most destructive conflict in human history. The men who died because they opened that innocent-looking crate never knew the name of the man who built it. They never understood the careful calculations that determined its size, its weight, its appearance, They simply saw a wooden box, investigated, and paid the ultimate price for curiosity in wartime. Their deaths were tragedies, as all war deaths are tragedies, but they were tragedies in service of a cause that had to be won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.